Welcome back to the Better Men, Better Ball Player podcast. I'm your host, Trey Cobb. I want to thank you for joining us here on our 87th episode of the podcast, where we get a chance to talk to Travis Hash. Travis Hash is the Director of Strength and Conditioning at Absolute Sports Performance. 2018, he helped open Absolute Sports Performance. He's one of the owners there as the Director of Strength and Conditioning. He's also the Strength and Conditioning Coach at Loyola Blakefield High School in Maryland, as well as he was formerly the strength and conditioning coach at CCBC Dundalk Community College for the baseball team as well. He's had a personal training background ever since high school, where he actually graduated high school with as a certified personal trainer. He is CSCS certified, and as you know, as you'll see through this conversation, is well versed, and he actually works with great athletes all around. Those people know and follow baseball for the baseball world. He works with Hartford Community College, so those people know the JUCO ranks well, know the kind of athletes that Hartford has, and he works with them and helps with their strength and conditioning, and is their strength and conditioning coach as well. So Coach Hash gets into his assessments. He gets into the programming things, how we're helping people that are multi-sports athletes, how we're helping, right now athletes are, sometimes playing two sports in the same season, and how do we help them train, and, what it takes to involve a successful program. And a lot of it comes down to the simple thing like coaches do is communication. He talks about communication, talks about how we got to be there to look at their intensity, see like, wow, they thought this was really hard, but it's actually programmed to be very light, and so we need to maybe give them a recovery or a deload week. And kind of helps you give like a shell of a program and how to how to adapt from that. It was a really great conversation, really enjoyed it. Hit the ground running from the get-go, and man, it was a lot of fun. So Coach Hash, I can't thank you enough, and can't thank those guys at Netting Pros for helping make this possible and help grow our podcast, and which is also then essentially help grow in the game, which this is all about. Will Miner, the guys at Netting Professionals, are improving programs one facility at a time. Netting Professionals specialize in design, fabrication, installation of custom netting for backstops, batting cages, dugouts, scoreboards, BP screens, and ball carts. They also design and install digital graphic wall padding, windscreen, turf protectors, dugout benches, dugout cubbies, and more. Netting Professionals continue to provide quality products and services to many recreation, high school, and college fields, facilities, and stadiums throughout the country. Contact the guys at Netting Pros at 844-620-2707 or info@nettingpros.com. Visit them online at www.nettingpros.com or check out Netting Pros on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn for all their latest products and projects. So again, thanks to Will Meyer, thanks to you guys, thanks for being part of the Netting Pros chat. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I know you will. I really enjoyed it. It helped me get better. Helps me just be a little bit more productive. It has me giving me a little more skin in the game for when I'm trying to talk to guys about their development and what they should be doing strength and conditioning wise, and also just another resource. Check this guy out. Make sure you're following him on Twitter as well at Hash Sports Performance. You can check him out on Twitter and Instagram. So let's get right down into it. Here he is, Coach Travis Hash, Absolute Sports Performance in Maryland.
Fortunately, like with young high school level athletes, like they're going to recover better than really they ever are going to at any other time in their life. So at least we have that going for us a little bit. They're not an older athlete that's going to need longer recovery time. So as long as if they're a 3-sport athlete and they're technically always in season, as long as those seasons are separated and they're only playing one sport at a time, which the tweet that you kind of brought up, that's not always the case, right? Like sometimes they're playing 2 sports at a time. They're playing indoor soccer and basketball at the same time, or they're playing fall baseball and football at the same time. So that's kind of a different conversation. But so long as those seasons are kind of separated, they should have ample amount of time to both train, recover, and still compete in their sport, assuming that the program is laid out correctly. If we're smashing them with really high volume and a lot of workload the day before a game, yeah, they're probably going to be sore the next day. However, if we allow, 48 to 72 hours between their training sessions and their next athletic bout, then we can manage that stress appropriately, assuming that their practice workload isn't crazy high.
So what would you consider? So, like, let's say you have a guy like that, and because I think we're all getting to that. I wouldn't say we're all, but like I think that conversation's coming up good bit is how would you program a kid like that is a three sport athlete? Because I think I think that's a realistic challenge that that coaches have when they go to plan right now for these workouts. Is like, okay, how can I get this basketball kid who knows he needs to get stronger? I wanted to play basketball, but like, how can we incorporate the lifting? What does it look like?
Sure. I mean, the biggest thing, and this is always a little bit of a challenge with high school athletes, is communication, right? They need to communicate their schedule to us. Like, okay, coach, like we have games on, just around Tuesday, Thursdays. That's when we have games, and we practice Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We're off on the weekends. Well, we definitely want to take advantage of one of those weekend days, going to be a lift day. And then we probably need to also lift on one of those practice days after practice. So maybe Friday's a good day for that, and then Monday, if we're able to get a third lift in, we can schedule it that way. We could lift on the game day after the game. It just depends on like if this player is a bench player or if they're a starter. But ideally, I'd like to have them lift on their practice days a little bit more. Now, from the programming perspective, our job is going to be to limit their stress as much as we can. So a couple of the things that we can do to help mitigate stress is, number one, athletes will typically have more soreness, more delayed onset muscle soreness from increased volume. They generally can handle low volumes and higher intensities. So they can handle a little bit higher weights as long as the volume is not too high, and they shouldn't feel a ton of soreness the next day. If we're out there squatting 3 sets of 10 reps the day before a game, we're probably sore the next day. If we're doing 3 sets of 3, we're probably not going to be sore the next day. And if the intensity is high enough, we can still drive some of those strength adaptations that we're looking for. The other thing that we can do is we know that eccentric, so eccentric being the lowering phase or the lengthening phase of lifts, causes more soreness than the concentric phase. So we can look at ways in our program, how can we eliminate some of the eccentric stress out of their program and focus more on the output of the concentric phase. So those are like some of the little strategies that we can implement to help mitigate that soreness while still allowing them to have strength adaptations and perform at the sport that they're currently playing.
That's cool. Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example, like just for me of like you would say, okay, this is more eccentric, so we're gonna go to this. Can you give me like an example of that?
Sure. So I think from like a hip hinge pattern.
Yeah,
Like we
exactly.
take 2 exercises that are a hip hinge, right? So we have an RDL, a Romanian deadlift, and that's when we have the bar out in front of us and we're lowering the bar down. We're getting that big stretch in the hamstrings, and then we're coming up and squeezing our butt at the top of the lift. The majority of that lift is a eccentric portion, right? That big stretch as we're reaching down towards the bottom. Okay, the concentric phase is coming up. So we have that stress from the eccentric portion. So say we wanted to get a hip hinge in that's a little bit less eccentric focused, we could do a hip thrust off of the floor or off of the bench. There's a lot limited range of motion on the eccentric phase, but we're still getting that big squeeze of our butt as we drive the weight upwards towards the top. So that would be like an example of one that's a little bit more concentric focused versus eccentric.
Cool. That's perfect. Okay, I appreciate that. That was great. So RDL versus the hip thrust. Okay,
And,
that's
and,
great.
and another thing you could do too is just limiting your range of motion. If you take like the back squat, for example,
Mm-hmm.
in the off season when we're not super worried about having a little bit more stress, then we can squat to full range of motion, utilize tempos and pauses and things of that nature. Versus in season, maybe we work, a squat to a box that's a little bit shortened range of motion, so that the eccentric stress isn't as great. So you can play with the range of the motion and joint angle specificity as well.
Okay, so in limiting range of motion. So would you say like just a simple box squat? Is that what you mean? Like going down to a box instead of going the full range?
Yeah, sure. You could squat to a box that's maybe slightly above parallel versus squatting full range of motion all the way down.
Okay.
That would be one way to limit stress. Now, there's pros and cons to that. You're going to miss out on some things, but that is an opportunity to decrease your overall stress.
Which is essentially what we're looking at. But like you said, it comes back to the communication of when are you doing it, or even like when you're programming it is, I guess you said like the communication between when are we competing, so we know like which way when to like I guess, limit or like know when we can push and say, because like I'm sure that you probably still have to get over the fact of like you're going to be sore. Do you ever get that? What are your thoughts on that?
A little bit, and really the best over, and this definitely I wanted to bring up is the best overall strategy to mitigate soreness is to train consistently. Our body gets sore when it is exposed to new stressors. I always think of it as most people, if you're not a bowler, you don't go bowling that often. If you've ever gone out bowling with friends, the next day you're feeling sore in all types of weird places, and that's because it's a new stressor. It's something your body is not used to. But if you bowled all the time, you wouldn't be as sore from that. So the same concept applies to the weight room. If we're training sporadically and our body is not used to training on a consistent basis, we're going to have a lot more soreness than if we're on a regular routine of 2 to 3 times a week and our body knows what to expect when it's coming in there. So that communication with the athlete is like, hey, like you might feel a little bit sore in the preseason or whatever, but if you stick with this and you're very consistent with your training, overall, we're going to be gaining strength, worst case, maintaining stuff that we've built in the off season, but you're not going to feel that soreness and fatigue as if you would if you took time off and came every other week or every 3 weeks or something like that. So that's part of communicating with them. And then, it's kind of like, you have a plan and you just have to be able to adjust it because, particularly in a sport like baseball with, the rain outs and reschedules and playing with all these schedules, what you thought might have been a day off actually ends up being a game day, and you have to be able to adjust on the fly with that too. But the athlete has to tell you; they got to let you know. That's the key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I mean, I've told guys like I think you're better off spending your money on a expert strength conditioning coach that's going to help you program it and have have this communication than you are paying for a hitting lesson. Depending on your age, depending on your situation, you're more likely to do that now because guys can do it virtually now. Like I'm sure you could probably put somebody on a program, right on an app, and help them out with their journey.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, and that's something that a lot of coaches are. That's a space that a lot of coaches are starting to get into is the online or remote programming space. And there's some out there that do a really good job with it. I personally prefer to see the athlete in person. That's kind of like that's what I like to do. But yeah, there's some really successful programs out there doing remote too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking, just say like after this call, someone's like, man, I really want to touch this brains guy, and if like that would be an opportunity for you know what I mean? But I just think that it's such a valuable part in certain people's development that they have to find someone that's going to work with them and kind of like you said, you got to communicate the schedule and then be an expert enough that someone's going to trust you with what you're going to be talking to them about, so that's all
Yep,
very important.
absolutely.
So like in terms of like. So those are just huge things. So how do you combat, like one of the tweets you were talking about was like the new thing of playing two sports, basically the multi-sport athlete playing the same sport, in the same season. How are you combating that?
Yeah, that is the toughest one because it seems like in a lot of maybe not so much in Maryland. Baseball doesn't seem to be all year round sport. I think our weather dictates that a little bit, so we have that advantage. But soccer seems to be played all the time, like pretty much year round. All the soccer athletes that we work with, some of them also play baseball, and that's why they end up playing two sports kind of at the same time: club soccer with either high school or club baseball. And that really is the big struggle because they're getting a lot of volume from both sports, and we have to understand that hey, like right now their sport is the priority, and we've got to kind of take a step back and adjust our volume down on the strength and conditioning side so that we're not over fatiguing them. And the conversation has to be even more advanced because like I've got soccer on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I've got baseball on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and we've got to figure out how we're going to get lifts in during that time period. I don't know that there's an ideal way to do it, and that's kind of like where the that tweet comes from. Is a little bit out of frustration. Is like, you know, you've got practice / games 6 to 7 days a week for 8 to 9 months out of the year. When are you really spending time developing? And the answer is you're not developing to the level that you could be. You are missing out on some level of development. So the overall answer is probably to pick one of those sports that is a priority. At some point, one of them will likely present as being your dominant or your go-to sport. And you've got to start to prioritize that. And maybe you're not year round in the other sport that's not your primary sport anymore. Doesn't mean you can't play it, but just have separated seasons, because otherwise you're setting yourself up for best case scenario underdevelopment, worst case scenario overuse injuries.
That's good. Underdevelopment, just based off of just not being able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean we've dealt with it a lot. I mean, we have a lot of athletes that
right now. I got 10-year-old twins, and my 10-year-old son gets pulled every direction. You know what I mean? And I
yeah.
have to step in, and do that right now. We're already making those decisions at 10. Like it's you're making decisions that never had been made before.
Well, and I think, I mean, you're talking about 10 years old, and I think it's starting even earlier. I mean, you have club level teams for 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. It used to be those were ages that kids played rec, maybe travel, and travel is still seasonal. Travel is not year round. So it's that's the big change, is like you're now starting to have a lot higher level of maybe not actual competition, but at least a higher level of training and overall structure earlier in these kids' athletic development careers, and that's in some ways been not the best case thing for them.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's not too many guys that are also part of that are incorporating the strength and conditioning part with it. It'd be different. Right. So like, I know, like, like my son's baseball program, like they were like right now as part of them to go to a place like ASP, part of them to go to where they will do a little bit basically like speed camp type of things. They don't pick up a baseball. They're playing dodgeball. They're pushing sleds. They're just kind of having fun in the weight room right now as kids. But like, it's nice to see that is part of the development, where, those things are also getting helped. But yeah, at the same time, like he's going to soccer and soccer's trying to wrap up here in the fall. And then you got basketball that just came in. So it's very unique for sure. And I think it's a real life problem. But like I said, even the coach right now, the high school coach who's programming or looking for the best type of program, he's going to have indoor track athletes. Yep. He'll have basketball athletes. He could have a wrestler, and these are all real life things challenges that he has to make. So how do you as a coach, what kind of advice would you give that guy with him balancing the track guy, the basketball guy, the wrestler, and then you've got his guy that's just baseball guys?
Yeah, and I'll speak on it more from the perspective that I'm most familiar with, which is the strength and conditioning, and this is something that and this is something we run into at Loyola a lot. So we actually it's pretty good timing, because right now fall sports either are ending if they're in the playoffs, or they just recently ended. So we've been working with our non-fall sport baseball guys for the last 2 months, and they're starting to get to a pretty good level of movement proficiency and starting to have that kind of foundation of strength built up. Now we've got 10 or 15 kids that just got done their fall sports jumping into the weight room and trying to get right into the swing of things. They cannot be expected to be at the same level as the guys that have had off and have been training for the last 2 months. So it's really about having a system in place. These things are going to happen, and you can at least plan and prepare for them. So with us, we have a tier system where all athletes, regardless of when they started, are going to start on a movement foundations block. And that'll help get them up to speed a little bit quicker than just throwing them into what everybody else is doing. So yeah, it's a little bit more stressful having 2 to 3 programs happening at one time. But long term, this is going to work better for those kids, so that they don't miss out on those foundational movement patterns, and they're not getting thrown into the fire of maybe a true strength block where they're not prepared for it. And then if they're not prepared for it, they're still at that increased risk of injury. So have a system in place and just be prepared for these things. You're going to have enough unexpected events happen, injuries and school cancellations and snow days, stuff that you can't plan for. So plan for the stuff that is going to happen. For the most part, who's coming in off of a different sport, who's leaving to go participate in a different sport. Just have a structure and a plan, and it'll make the transitions a lot more smooth.
You said the foundations of movement. What are your other tiers?
Sure. So we typically, with our high school athletes, and most of these athletes are untrained, we are going to start off with movement foundations block, and that is going to be our foundational movement patterns. So for me, that's our squat, our hinge, a unilateral movement, typically a split squat or a lunge, and then horizontal pushing and pulling. So horizontal pushing could be like a push-up or a bench press. Vertical could be an overhead press. Pulling overhead could be a lat pull down or a chin up. And then traditional rows are horizontal pulling. We want to make sure that they're good at all of these foundational movements. I literally think of this as like the foundation of our house. If we don't have those basic movement patterns down, we do not want to load on top of those poor movement patterns. So that's phase one for us. After that, we are going to then go into a little bit of a accumulation or a volume block, where we're going to build up our work capacity. So we've got our movements nailed down in the last block. Now we're going to start to build on top of those movements and make sure that our body has the capacity to do a fair amount of work through those movement patterns. So this is where you'll see our higher volume work happening. That's actually the block that my guys at Loyola are in right now. They're building up that volume. We're working a little bit higher rep ranges. We will then progress into a more true strength block. Our volume is going to come down a little bit. Our intensity will come up, and it will be about maximal output and making sure that we are able to produce enough force to do the things that we want to do in our sport. And then lastly, we'll start to shift the focus into power and speed strength and some of the things that are going to translate or have a higher translation directly to the field.
Awesome. So when you get to these different phases, so like going back to the guy, like, so you're building all this power and speed. So basically the end goal is the power and speed comes right before you start the season.
Correct. Yeah, we want to essentially be peaking our power and speed as we're getting ready to go into that season, so that we can come out of the gate pretty hot. And then once we get into season, it's about maintaining those qualities. So we've spent this whole off season from building the foundation to building the strength base to then producing power and speed output. We've now got to maintain that the best that we can throughout the course of the season. But yeah, ideally we're peaking those qualities right before the season.
As we enter the season. So then when you go in season, are the blocks still the same, or just the accumulation blocks look down? You're probably staying away from accumulation. So
right.
You're staying within the strength and the power speed blocks.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So we're more so trying to maintain the speed and power, because those are going to be the most specific adaptations to our sport, right? I've never had a coach saying, man, I wish our guys were slower and less powerful, so those are going to be what we're trying to maintain. So the way that an in-season program is going to look for us is going to be a little bit lower on the volume side, again, because we're not trying to create a ton of fatigue. So that's why, as you mentioned, we wouldn't go back through the accumulation, but we're definitely going to make sure that we're touching on both sprint work, power work, whether it be plyometrics or loaded jumps and plyometrics, and then also our strength. We do have to touch a little bit of higher end strength. It doesn't have to be crazy. We're certainly not maxing out in season, but we do have to work above 80-85% on occasion to maintain those strength adaptations that we spent all off season building.
Okay, so above 80%. So I'm assuming that above 80% you have a test of some sort, so you probably have maxed, so that way they know they're 80-85%.
Roughly, right. I typically program using a something called a rating of perceived exertion, or RPE, and that allows us to create an estimated 1 rep max. I'm not a big believer in doing a true 1 rep max, outside of the sport of powerlifting. We occasionally will work at heavy 3 rep max, but really we're working at what we would call a 9.5. A 9 or a 9.5 RPE, which means you have like maybe 1 rep left in the tank. So we're never truly actually finding a max or maxing out, but within our strength block and within our training, we are working up to heavy triples and doubles at times. And that gives us a pretty good gauge of where our actual max sits, and we can estimate based off that.
Okay, so that's cool. That leads me into a lot of the assessments. Because looking at another tweet, you're talking about like if you don't have assessment, you're just kind of guessing, and that's really where this kind of comes from. So like so what you're saying with the RPE is a kid gets to a certain type of weight, and if he can only get one more, then he knows his max, quote unquote, max is about
Right.
that, right?
Yep.
Is that how
Yeah.
you
So,
think?
for example, if we have a kid and I say, I want you to deadlift this weight for 2 reps at a 9 RPE. And so he does his 2 reps. He should know that he could do 1 more repetition, but not be able to do 2 more. So essentially, he has found his estimated 3 rep max.
Okay.
Yep.
That's good clarification. Okay. So essentially he's finding his 3 rep max. Okay.
Yeah, and the good thing too about RPE is, anyone that is lifted before knows that the same weight does not feel the same every day. Some days you're coming in, you're feeling really good, and 300 pounds feels like nothing, and it's moving really fast. And then the next week you come in and you're not feeling as good, and 300 pounds feels like the heaviest weight possible. That is the reason that we utilize a rating of perceived exertion, because on one day 300 pounds might be a 7 RPE, and on one day it might be a 9 RPE. So it's a little bit more fluid, and it's based on how the athlete is feeling. It takes into account what their readiness is rather for that given training session. Versus a percentage is just a straight number.
Yeah.
You're lifting 80% today, and that's what you're lifting. That number doesn't have a whole lot of flexibility in it.
So, but then the RPE takes into account for like you have to really know your guys, where knowing like, hey, you need to be pushed.
Yep.
Like, hey, I know you can do more than this, so you have to be there, really kind of coach them up as well, though.
Yep, and to me that's coaching, and that's where our job really comes into play. Once the movement foundation is there, once they move. I mean, don't get me wrong. We've got very advanced athletes that still need help with their basic movements at times. They're not always doing everything perfect, but once they're doing most things pretty well, pretty consistently, the real coaching comes in and is managing their workload, their volumes, and their intensities. And part of managing their intensities is making sure that they're working at the appropriate RPE.
Managing workloads, yep, and intensity. Yeah, I think that's it right there. Real coaching comes into managing workloads and intensity. Absolutely.
Yep.
So, what was another form of assessment that you like to use? So you have the RPE, and I'm sorry, just so I'm clear on the RPE, because you said an RPE of 9, RPE of 7.
Sure.
Because I'm just trying to understand this myself.
Yep.
Finding a weight. Okay, so like if you say we're working at a 9 RPE, so that basically means like you're not able to get 1 more rep, and then
you can do 1 more.
I could do 1 more. So then,
correct.
What's the set? Like, so it's a rating scale of like RP is 1 to 10.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a RPE scale. Typically, so for cardiovascular, there's a different RPE scale, and it's 6 to 20. So if you Google RPE scale, like that may be the first thing that pops up. That's not the one I'm discussing right now.
Okay.
The one I'm discussing is rated from 1 to 10, and basically working from down to 1 up to 10. The way it works is 1 is like little to no effort involved. So I kind of think of this as like our dynamic warm up. Like you could probably do a dynamic warm up almost all day long and not really get tired. So that's like a 1 RPE. The 2 to 5 RPE range is very, very light weights. Stuff that you can do 8 to 10 plus additional reps of. So if I'm doing 10 reps of an exercise and I'm working at like a 3 or 4 RPE, I probably could do 20 reps of that exercise. This is typically like our warm up sets and things like that. Once you get up a little bit higher, 6 RPE means we have about 4 or 5 reps left in the tank. So if I'm doing 10 reps of an exercise, this means that at max I could do 14 or 15. And then it kind of builds up that way. 7 RPE is 3 repetitions remaining. 8 RPE is 2 repetitions remaining. 9 RPE is 1 repetition remaining. And then a 10 RPE is your max. That's your max effort. You could not do any more weight.
Got it.
And that's just one of the ways that you can prescribe intensities. The one that most people are familiar with is percentages. So I'm prescribing 80% this week, 85% next week. Another way to do it is reps in reserve, which is similar to RPE, where it tells you how many repetitions you have remaining. So I could say, I want you to do this exercise until you have 3 reps left in the tank and then stop. And then RPE, again, is very similar. You're assigning the RPE number, and that lets you know how many repetitions you should be able to complete afterwards.
So you would stop and say, yep, I can do 5 more, or I can do 3 more. I'm good there.
I'm going to stop there. That's correct.
Okay, so that's how you're managing the intensity.
Right, and you're keeping kids from maxing out, trying to max out on every single set.
There you go. Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, thanks for that. I just needed to kind of
Yeah,
clarify my brain of what it was like, and so that's cool. So any other kind of assessments that you do
sure.
to
Yeah, so with all of our new athletes, we have an assessment process, and it kind of goes back to, one of those things that I tweeted out, and it was, if you're not assessing, you're just guessing. However, like the assessment has to make sense for you and for your athlete base, your
Yeah,
client
that's
base.
what
So
I liked
whatever,
how you said that. You can't copy and paste it from,
right,
from Alabama because you probably don't have Alabama's,
100%. And
you
like
know, what they have
I'm
access
guilty
to.
of this too. Like this is stuff that I've learned along the way. Is like I copied and pasted an assessment process at one point in time, and I'm doing it, and I'm looking at the results of the assessment, and I don't even understand really what I'm looking at. It's like those things aren't going to make sense to you if they're not making actionable changes into your programming, and they're not real determinants of what you're adding in or excluding from different programs for the athletes. And then why are you wasting your time performing these assessments? So that was my main point of that is like let's select items or assessments that are actually going to make changes and actually give us more information that we're going to be able to use with our athletes. So for us, we start off with a movement screening, and it's very similar to those basic movements that I described earlier. We're taking our athletes through basic variations of a squat pattern, a hinge pattern, a single leg pattern, and then different pushes and pulls to see what their movement competency is at currently. If we have an athlete come in and we ask them to hinge and they squat and they have no idea how to do the hinge pattern correctly, then we know that's part of our program that we need to add in there. We need to teach this kid how to hinge properly because, especially with working with primarily baseball players, our whole sport is in a hinge position.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the assessments that we do. We have about 10 movement patterns that we take athletes through, and we're taking notes and writing down different aspects of those movements, and then utilizing those to add the different movements into their programs. And from that assessment, we're able to see again movement competency, if they have any like mobility limitations or inability to perform certain movements, and also what their training experience is. If they come in and they know all the lifts or all the movements on the assessment before, probably a good chance that they've trained before. And then after that, we're doing performance testing. So we're looking at jumps and sprints primarily. So we'll use with our facility, we don't have a huge turf space, so we'll utilize the 10-yard dash is kind of our primary sprint test. We use the 5-10-5 or the Pro Agility Shuttle to measure change of direction ability. We will use the vertical jump, the broad jump, and a single leg lateral bound to measure both bilateral and unilateral power output via jumps.
And I'm assuming you collected all that data where you can then probably correlate, where guys need to maybe focus their attention on.
Yep. Yeah, and the way that we do that is two ways. There's normative data available for NCAA athletes, so I can look up and see, okay, the average NCAA baseball player has an 8-foot, 1-inch broad jump. So I can compare, Johnny that just signed up with us to say, hey, like right now you're sitting around 7.5 inches, and we're trying to work our way towards the 8-foot one. And that kind of lets him know where he stands in comparison to maybe where he wants to be. The other thing that we do at ASP is we kind of compile all of the data from every athlete that has ever tested here, and we come up with normative data for our facility and our athlete population here. So we can actually compare Johnny, say he comes in with the 7.5 broad jump, and say, hey, like you're right on the average of what the average athlete that comes in our facility is jumping at, and compare him to his actual peers. Because the normative data, number one, sometimes gets outdated. They don't update this data all the time. And number two, it may not apply. As you mentioned, like if you don't have Alabama's athletes, you probably shouldn't compare your athletes to the Alabama's athletes.
Point. Great point. Yeah. Hinge, jumps, sprints. So you just focus on the hinge, jumps, and sprints. Those are the three testings that you do?
No. So the movement assessment is 10 different assessments in itself.
So those are
But
3 things inside of that.
yeah, well, the movement is kind of well, it's 10 things, but it's focused around the 5 basic movement patterns: the hinge,
Okay.
squat, lunge, push, and pull.
Right, that's right.
And then our performance testing is focused around broad jump, vertical jump, lateral jump, single leg lateral bound, and then 5-10-5 pro agility shuttle, and the 10-yard dash. That's the majority of our performance assessment.
Cool. So how do you individualize within that? So now that you have the assessments, what you guys need. So do you build so do you kind of shell out what you want for a team? Like, I know you work with Hartford, you work with Loyola.
Sure.
So do you kind of shell out what you want the team to do, and then do you bucket like these hinge guys, these pull guys, like how do you use the assessments for the individual?
Sure. Well, or for the individual or for like the team setting?
Well, the individual within the team setting, because I
Right.
think that's where a lot of the guys are really looking to do. Like, yeah, like this is great, but how can I manage that? How would I be able to, still get what Travis needs?
Mhm.
And Trey's totally different. Trey's needs more of the hinge work when
Yep.
the Travis needs more of the bilateral work. You know what I mean? What do you
Yeah,
do?
absolutely. So that is one of the struggles in working with a large team. So I'll utilize Hartford because they're the largest team that we work with. We have 53 athletes that we're working with them. So number one, we look at our test data, and with them we actually incorporate a few other tests. But so we have a few more data points on them. But we look at the test data and we say, okay, what is like the average? What does the mean of this team really need? Or what are the areas that we are mostly lacking on? And then that kind of gives us like a starting point. And from there, we are going to build our movement foundations block around where that starting point is. So during that first month where we're cleaning up movements, that allows us to individualize and focus a little bit more on each individual athlete, because we can't write 53 individualized programs and have them all run simultaneously. In an ideal world, that's the best way to do it for sure. But it's just rarely, if ever. I mean, I've never been in a setting where that's 100% practical. But it doesn't mean that you can't have areas of emphasis for each of those guys. So as you mentioned, if I'm more of a hinge guy, I'm better at hinging. Well, during that foundations block, but I'm not very good at squatting. During that foundations block, I'm going to focus and have a lot more of an emphasis on the squatting with that athlete. I'm going to be on that kid a lot more about his squat and coaching him up and cueing him up a lot more on that given pattern. And when he gets to his hinge pattern, I already know that he's pretty good at that. I'm going to let him be a little bit, and I'm going to go focus on you that isn't as good as the hinge pattern. And that's kind of how we can individualize. So you're coaching, you're on floor coaching, and prescribing individualized weights. Okay, not every kid lifting the same weight is going to be the best way that you can individualize training for a large team setting. How you cue each athlete and how you prescribe weights to each athlete is going to be the most individualized form of training that you can get with a large group like that.
Okay, so that's the best way to individualize it, is to prescribe the weight. When you say cue them is basically putting them in certain groups, putting them into certain weaknesses.
No, cue it, how you coach them up. So
Cue them. Oh, you
yeah.
mean like an external cue? Okay, sorry.
Yes, exactly. What coaching cues you utilize with each athlete, because they're not going to work all the same. If I've got 10 guys in front of me, doing a squat, if I just yell out the same cue, I might end up with 10 different things going on. And that's part of coaching is knowing how to relay your message to the individual athletes.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. The cueing is important, and I think most baseball coaches will definitely agree with you that. I mean, one guy that says you stay behind the ball is a lot different than that. That's just means a lot different to other people, and that's for sure.
Yeah, and I mean we see it in the weight room all the time. If for example, with a squat, if we have an athlete that isn't sitting his hips back far enough in the squat, he's very like a big time knee bender, very very quad dominant squatter. I may call out a cue like, "Hey, sit your hips back," and that may not click at all to him. But if I say to him, hey, sit down like you're sitting into a chair, then magically he might be able to sit his hips back, and he gets into the position that I ultimately want. So it's a little bit of trial and error. You'll come up with, a repertoire of cues or an arsenal of cues that have worked historically for you. And you just kind of rotate through those and see which one resonates best with the athlete.
Absolutely. I think it's just like a pitching coach would be.
Yeah,
Hitting coach,
exactly.
same thing.
Yeah, the worlds are not that different.
Awesome, man. What has been so when you think of development wise, like I'm just thinking about like, you work with Hartford has, JUCO,
Mhm.
very, highly recruited kids,
Yeah.
can play at a high level. Then you're going with like freshmen who are just now getting under the bar. Is that even another layer of your development, like another layer of the individual attention, or is that why that phase one is built in there, I guess?
That's why that phase one is so important. And I know for, if we have an athlete that's a sophomore that trained with us the year before, or if an athlete has been training throughout their high school career, sometimes, they could get a little frustrated. Like, yeah, man, why am I doing the basic stuff? Like, I know how to do this. But again, we've had high level athletes train in the facility that still do not perform all of their movements well all the time. So even, I mean, particularly at a JUCO, but even at a 4-year school, it never hurts to reestablish that foundation. Now, depending on your group, and again, this is where your assessment comes into play. If everybody moves really well in their assessment, maybe we only need to touch up on the movement foundations block for a week or 2 weeks. If everybody moves really bad, maybe we need a whole month of movement foundations focus first. So depending on how well they move, that determines how long we need to emphasize and focus on their basic movement patterns and range of motion through the lifts. But that's where the weight individualization comes in. So, say you have an athlete that does move really well, but the rest of the team doesn't. Well, that athlete can utilize heavier weight. Okay, we can adjust his volumes. We can do a lot of things while still doing the same general program that the rest of the team is doing to make it a little bit more suitable for his current level. And then eventually the team is going to catch up to him, right? The team's going to improve their ability to move, and everybody will be back on the same program again. However, the weights and intensities are still going to be different and individualized for each athlete.
Weights and intensity will coming that RP. So you're saying some guys could be like maybe on a 2, and some guys might be on a 6.
Yeah, well, we probably wouldn't prescribe a 2 just because that's like a warm up
Okay.
set. But typically we're prescribing between 6 and 9 RPEs for the most part. But that's going to be that's going to mean different. What is an 8 RPE to me is going to be different than an 8 RPE to you. Just like
That's true.
80% would be different between the two of us. So
That's true.
that's a one level of individualization as well. I've heard of programs before where, hey, every athlete's lifting 135 today. And then next week we're all lifting 145. And that might work for some guys, but there's some dudes that can't handle that weight, or maybe that weight is well below their level. So individualizing through the amount of weight that the athlete is lifting is super important too. When we get into season, things can be a little bit different for a starting pitcher who's got to pitch the next day. If the rest of the team is scheduled to, lift a 9 RPE triple, maybe it doesn't make sense for him to do that. Maybe we reduce his RPE a little bit down to a 7.5 or something like that. Or maybe he likes to lift heavy, so we keep the intensity up. We just drop that volume down a little bit lower. So it's making some of those adjustments on the fly. That's important too.
So can you get into like how do you determine that? Like because I'm sure that's part of people see you. Yeah, you're in the weight room with those guys, but that has to be because that's basically like a pitching coach who charts the game, goes home, analyzes the game, and then prescribes maybe a blueprint series or prescribes flat ground work or prescribes those kind of things. That's essentially what you're doing. So I guess my question is like thinking through that is, okay, we have this data, okay, from the assessment. And as you're going through there, then like you said, the best way for you to individualize your program is through the weights and intensity. Okay. So how do you what would determine who who's lifting which amount of weight and for which intensity.
Yeah, and this goes again to why I love RPE, because they're able in some ways to kind of determine that themselves. Like they know what an 8 RPE feels like better than I'm going to, right? Because it's not going to be the same. So we will prescribe them the intensity that we want them working at. So whether we prescribe a 7 or 8 RPE, whatever we prescribe for the athlete on that given day, they then are doing their warm up sets and working up until they feel themselves at that prescribed intensity. So that kind of like automates the process a little bit. The athletes are able to make those decisions. Now, as a coach, I can look and say, hey, man, like that's moving really fast today. That doesn't really seem like it's an 8 RPE, or a 9 RPE. How many more reps do you think you could have gotten? And they'll be like, yeah, well, I think I could have gotten 3 or 4 more. Okay, well then we need to increase the weight today. We're looking pretty good. Like our readiness is pretty high right now. Let's get after it a little bit. Or it could be the other way. And I say 8 RPE and the athlete is grinding out that last rep. And I'm looking at him like, there's no way he can do 1 more rep. I'll go up to him and ask, like, hey man, are you sure you could do 2 more reps of that? And most times they're going to be pretty honest if you check in with them. Like, no, I don't think so. And I'm like, all right, well, let's go down today. Like, we can't expect ourselves to be at our best every day. So that's a pretty important note to see is making sure that you're watching the athletes and seeing how that they're moving and how the weight is moving. There are some other tools that you can utilize. In our setting, we don't have access to them all the time, which would be like a bar speed, velocity-based training. There's some evidence out there, some numbers out there that correlate different bar speeds with different RPEs or percentages. So if I'm working at a 8 RPE, I should be moving the bar X meters per second. And if I'm not moving it in that range, then it's really not the right weight for the given day. That's something we do have bar speed sensors, but we don't have them for every barbell when we're working with a large team. So it's just not something that's practical. So right now, in our current situation, we're relying a lot on our coaches observing the room and watching the reps.
Yeah, but I think that's more with the majority of people. That's what people need to know. We need to know what we need to look at. What do we need to coach up? And like I said, I think it's very easy for a person we can relate to. All right, we saw this bullpen series, or we saw this. Here's your data from the game, and we're going to program X, Y, and Z drill, X, Y, and Z flat, flat ground bullpen. So I think there's a correlation there. So it's a matter of, okay, well, what do I do in terms of so do you look at the hills and valleys? Like we're building up to the first day of our game, our first competition, our first game, right? That's basically what you're putting up to. So is it just a seriously natural progression of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? What is the peaks and valleys that look like?
Yeah. And one thing that kind of goes in with this too is like, we have our initial assessment, but that just tells us our starting point. Really, like we should be assessing our athletes every single day. Every day that they're in the weight room, we're assessing the way that they move, how much weight that they are moving, how well they're moving it, what they're reporting their RPEs at. So like every day you should be paying attention to your athletes, and that's the only way that you can really stay in touch with them. Because sometimes, like if you're not paying attention, like you may run the athletes so much into the ground that they're getting overtrained or they're super fatigued and they're performing worse than they were before. But if you're paying attention and you're monitoring how much weight they're lifting, what they're reporting certain weights at different RPEs at, like, oh wow, like we're looking kind of fatigued. Like we might need to take a deload week a little bit here, which kind of leads into what you're saying. It is not a straight linear progression. I don't think any level of progress forever is just going to be straight up without any valleys in there. You'll have your peaks and valleys. Ideally, you want that trend averaging upwards, but things come up and down. And that's definitely something that we are dealing with all of our athletes. But our more advanced ones, we're programming in set weeks where we're going to deload. So within a given training cycle, a very basic style of deloading is to build them up for 3 weeks. So for example, we're going to go 7 RPE week 1, 8 RPE week 2, maybe 9 RPE week 3, and then we're going to drop them back down to 6 RPE. And then we pick back up at 7, 8, and 9, and hopefully those next 3 weeks weights are higher than the previous month's RPEs were for that given weight exercise. So yeah, it's definitely monitoring that workload. If all we do is climb, and we don't allow them to have a little bit of a break or a little bit of a deload period, uh, you're going to end up with a lot of kind of burnt out and fatigued athletes. We can't expect them just to continuously climb once they've reached a minimal training age.
Yeah, that's great. Um, and then within that, so like you said, like so basically there's your shell. Your shell is 3 weeks strong, 1 week deload. If I see that Trey is not able to handle this, go to the third week, are you going to keep him at second week? Like, is that depending? Is that like you said, the weights and the intensity? That's all part of that conversation there, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't always work out that way. And I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, and it's not the way that we necessarily do it all the time. Like you don't have to go 3 weeks on, then 1 week down. That's
Yeah.
just kind of like your classical deload. If you looked up deloading online, that's probably the first thing that'll pop up. But that's where like checking with your athletes each day. And we actually had a situation somewhat recently happen with one of our athletes. Is we had been building up for a few weeks, and this was supposed to be a big week. Like we were going to go triples, 3 reps at a 9 RPE, 1 rep or 9.5 RPE, maybe 1 rep left in the tank. So really heavy weight. And he was amped up for it. We were amped up for it. We wanted to do it. And then we get to the week, and like his numbers just aren't coming in the way that we want him to. Like he's obviously a little bit more fatigued. He's feeling a little bit more sore. His readiness is not at the level that we wanted to. So we had to make an adjustment. Like, okay, like, you know what? We're going to take our deload week here, and we're going to start back up the following week instead of taking our deload next week. So it's about managing that program. You can write it all down on paper and have an idea of the way that it's going to go. But I think anybody that's been a coach at anything that's written any type of practice plan or workout program knows that it very rarely ends up playing out the exact way you thought it would. And you just have to know. You've got to be kind of expect the unexpected sometimes with that, and be cool with adjusting. Because at the end of the day, did I want that athlete? Do I want him, like the meathead in me? Do I want him to lift that heavy weight on that day? Yeah. And he probably does too, because he's a little bit of a meathead too. But we're not power lifters, right? He's training to get better at baseball. He's not training just to get better at training. So we've got to be smart with that, and we can't do anything that's going to jeopardize his performance on the field for a little bit of a ego bump and a little bit of a meathead weight room lifting.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Man, this is great. This is great stuff, Trev. I guess another thing I'm just getting into, because I think that was super valuable. Again, I think you're just basically helping guys clear a plan of like what they need to do and what it looks like. The adaptability is absolute. I think like you said, anybody, and you get it because you've been around and so that the adaptability within the plan is very important.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad that great to hear that. So I guess the question is, looking at, what kind of advice, would you give the coach who's by himself? He is the strength coach for the baseball program. They don't have a Travis Hash, they can just come in and be the strength coach for the program. What would your advice be for that guy running his show? He's trying to do it for his athletes.
Yeah, my biggest advice would be to track as much as you can, and start with an assessment. Start with one that you can handle. I mean, because if you're one, like I don't do the same assessment at Loyola that we do at ASP. At ASP, we've got a staff, we have interns, we have more technology here, we have a lot more toys to play with. When I go offsite, if I'm at a different school, it might be me and a stopwatch. So pick a few things that you think are important. Okay, whether it's a couple sprint tests or a couple jumping tests, and assess those and do it from the beginning. Get your baseline assessment, and then assess those again periodically throughout the course of your training. Because if you believe that those things translate to the athletes getting better, we should see those numbers get better over time. And if they're not, then that's a pretty good indication that we need to make an adjustment to our program. So number one, identify KPIs, key performance indicators that work for you and that are practical and you can track easily and quickly with your athletes. That would be the first thing I would recommend. The second thing, and I think a lot of high school weight rooms miss out on this, is they write a workout program on the whiteboard, and they just write it on the board, and every kid comes in and just does the program on the board. high school kids, they are not always the best at remembering what they did even yesterday, certainly not the week before or 3 weeks ago. So, how do we know our athletes are getting stronger if we haven't recorded any of their weights that they've done? I think I'm a big proponent of having the athletes have their own training cards. We print out a training card for every athlete that they work with, and they're to be writing their reps or their weights in for each set that they are doing. And this allows us to track. If I tell Johnny, "Hey, Johnny, like what weight were you lifting 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago?" He's probably not going to know if he doesn't have it written down. But if he has it on his paper, like, "Oh wow, like I was only lifting 135 4 weeks ago, and now I'm doing the same amount of reps, but I'm doing 170." Right? So like it's naturally shown progression there. And we can also monitor it. Like if I look at an athlete's card and they've lifted the same weight for the last 4 weeks, um, I need to go up to that kid and ask him what's going on. Maybe he's feeling run down. Maybe he's feeling tired and fatigued and needs a little bit of a reset. It probably shouldn't get to 4 weeks, by the way. I should be checking in a lot more frequently than that. Or he just doesn't understand RPE. Like maybe he thinks because he doesn't understand that he's supposed to be increasing the weight each week or when he's supposed to be increasing it. So have a plan written out that the athletes can record their own weights in. Because again, your initial key performance indicator tracking is important, but the best assessment you do is every day that they come into the weight room. You're assessing how much weight they lift and how well they move. And if they have it down on the training card, it's a lot easier to track these things.
Mm-hmm. So those two. So having assessments and making sure that it's written down where people can actually write a written out plan where they can track their weights.
Yeah, because I think you can write a really great program on a whiteboard. There's nothing against writing and you can still write it on there if you want
right,
to.
Right. Yeah,
have them record.
You're saying you can still have them on the board so they can see it. And they come in there what they're doing, but like, all right, take your card, make sure you write your stuff down.
Yeah, because that's the best way to make adjustments and track. It's hard to adjust numbers that you don't know.
That's right. That's great. That is big time stuff. Lastly, because here we are about an hour in,
Okay.
which is awesome. I was thinking like the last thing is like, because you're involved with baseball, you know the baseball side of things. Guys right now are keeping arm care and arm strength, those kind of things. I'm looking at, how do you incorporate maybe some baseball specific movements? Like you said, the hinge pattern. But I'm even talking as much as like arm care and stuff like that.
Sure.
How kids incorporate those kind of things, because their strength coach at the high school might not be about like, but what could he maybe bring to say, hey, here's what I could do that maybe help with my arm.
Yeah, and well, number one, when it comes to arm care, I always like to say like those foundational movements, whether it's the squat or the hinge, deadlifts and single leg movements, that still has to be your foundation. You can do all the arm care in the world that you want to, but if you don't have a good foundation, you're going to be trying to fire a cannon out of a canoe, and it's just not going to go very well. So you have to have that foundation first, and that should be the priority in my opinion still. So you should start your workout out with the big bang items, so like your big movement patterns. Then when you get into your accessory work, so more towards the end of your workout programming, that's where I'm programming our arm care stuff. And for me, arm care kind of breaks down into a few different categories. The first one is going to be rotator cuff strengthening, so strengthening exercises. These ones most kids know and are doing already, whether it's the J band, internal and external rotations, either low or up at the 90-degree angle. But going through range of motion with the shoulder joint specifically, lighter weights, trying to adapt the body to volume there, and strengthening the rotator cuff. That's usually like the first level of arm care that I like to think of. The second one is our scaps, right? So you hear a lot about like scaps, whether it be pitching or hitting, and we just want to make sure that we have, number one, we have a good range of motion with our scaps. Our scaps are moving the way that they're supposed to be through a full range of motion, and that we can control them, that we're actually in control of where our scaps are moving. The shoulder is the most freely movable joint in the body. So most people have full range of motion at the shoulder, particularly young athletes. But having stability in those different positions is super important. So some of the things that we'll do for scap work is like landmine presses, where we're really focused on reaching all the way up, feeling that shoulder blade upwardly rotate and elevate towards the armpit, And then on rows, making sure that we're getting full range of motion into retraction and protraction, going both ways through our row work. And then lastly is timing. And a lot of most of the time I'll leave this more so on the skill side because they tend to do a lot more of this stuff over there. But making sure that our rotator cuff is able to fire on time and when it's supposed to. So this is where like a body blade or doing med ball drops and different things where our body is contracting and relaxing rapidly comes into place. That's how I break down the 3 stages of arm care. Typically in the weight room, we'll focus mostly on the rotator cuff strengthening in the movement and control of the scapula.
Cool. Yeah, the timing would be like your up tosses and stuff like that, your shoulder too.
Yep, up tosses and different like reverse catches and throws and things like that. That's rotator cuff timing.
Like even trampoline work.
Trampoline work's another one. Yep, 100%. And the kids typically that we're working with are getting a lot of that on the skill side. If they weren't and they came to us and like, hey man, I'm not doing it, then we can program that in a little bit too.
Yeah, for sure.
But I do want to make sure that the kids know like that is accessory work. Like all that stuff is important and it matters, but it won't matter if you're weak everywhere else. You have to be able to support your body and support the stressors that the sport puts on your body everywhere else, right? So proximal stability allows for distal mobility. It's an old saying, but it's very true.
Love that. Accessory work. You have to be strong in the fundamentals and foundation, I would say.
Yep.
In the foundational movements. Yeah, that's great. Or you're gonna get hurt. Absolutely. It's such a valuable thing. And I think everybody now, everybody like, okay, I know I need to get in the weight room. Now we gotta make it better. Now like, all right, is it everybody just doing these exercises on the whiteboard and go? Now we got a little bit better. Like you said, try to assess, assess what you really want. And I guess what you kind of hit on this, like, okay, if I want to test and I'm going to retest these things, like then you have to practice them. Like you have to, like, these would also be movements that you would probably be practicing that would, what you're saying is going to make them better when you retest them.
Right. Yeah. And ideally you're selecting things and like, there's a lot more than just like the basic sprints and jumps that you can assess. Like we assess with our college guys, we assess medicine ball throws and bar speed, velocity, and some of the things that we can do on the smaller scale at ASP. But whatever you're assessing, it should matter for the sport. Like it should be assessing a skill or a trait or a characteristic that you deem as valuable for the given sport. So for example, like our lateral jump, our lateral bound, like single leg force production, is very important for the sport, really all sports, but for the sport of baseball, because everything is starting off with that, whether it's a throw or we're swinging, we're driving off of a single leg and then absorbing force onto the other single leg. So we need to be able to produce and absorb force on a single leg. And for us, the lateral bound has been a good assessment to track that with our athletes. So making sure that you're tracking those things and making sure that the athletes are getting better at them. Because if they're not getting better and you think that getting better will help them at their sport, well, then something's off with the program.
Yeah, the program is coming out. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, okay, so let's say lateral jumps. Like, I know it's very specific, but like, so if you don't just do lateral jumps to continue to get better at lateral jumps, like, so what are other things? So like, all encompassing of the lateral jump. So I think that would even be the expert of like me having to reach out to you and say, hey man, I would love to do lateral jumps. Like, what other things would help me become better at lateral jumps?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the program kind of comes into play is right. Like, so what do we have to have in order to do any type of jump? Well, number one, we have to have a baseline level of force production, right? Strength, right? Like if you are not strong enough to get your body off of the ground, you are not going to be jumping very high or very far or getting much of anywhere. So what is one thing that can help us with a lateral jump? Well, how about a split squat or a single leg lunge or a lateral lunge to even get more specific, to stay in the same plane? That's developing force in the specific plane that jump takes place in. What's the next thing that is important with lateral jump is or any jump is rate of force production. So how quickly can we produce that force, right? That's the whole argument is, oh, power lifters, they lift a lot of weight, but, you never see them run a 40-yard dash. They're not very quick. And, that's true, right? Like we have to have force production, and then we also have to produce that force quickly. So there's other jump variations that we can move in, or we can just lift at a lower percentage weight or a lower RPE and try to move quickly through these range of motion to make sure that we're training both strength and speed kind of in conjunction with one another. So, for example, we could do a variation of the jump, whether it's a speed skater or a Haydn, some people will call it. That's going to help us improve our rate of force production for the lateral jump. And if we put those two things together, we have greater force and we're able to produce that force quicker. Our jump should get better. Mm-hmm. And if our jump gets better because we're able to produce more force and produce it faster, then also when we step in the batter's box or we step on the mound, we should also then have more force and be able to produce that force quicker. Mm-hmm. We would expect those skills to get better too.
No, I think that's it. I think that's it, man. It's a great spot, man. I think that's all at the essentially of it. That's the core of it, and then my mind even went to like it might not even be a problem with the exercise. It could be a problem with, like you said, how we're prescribing the intensity and the weights. If maybe go there, and then like you said, it's all about the adaptation. How are you adapting to it, and how are you looking at the kid? Maybe the kid's not doing as much as he should. Is he giving his effort? Do you do anything like, speaking of that, like, will you assess their effort? Like, will they come in and will you, like, you say, hey, like, how'd you sleep last night? What's your soreness like? How are you feeling right now? Because like you said, your RPE at 8 could be different today than it is tomorrow, or it also could be different what it is after school than it is on Saturday.
Yeah. And that's a really important point is overall readiness. With our high school athletes, it's not something that we're assessing all the time. It's just it's one of those things where it's not always practical to it. However, we have a collegiate development program that we run in the summer, where we're working with college athletes and we're seeing them 6 days a week. They're in the facility for about 3 or 4 hours, 6 days a week. They're not lifting weights the whole time, certainly not. They're doing a bunch of other stuff. But with them, every day that they're coming in, they have a pre-lift or a pre-activity and a post-activity questionnaire. And we are asking them things. We're asking them, how much sleep did you get? Are you feeling unusually sore, tired, or unmotivated, more than normal? How much stress are you experiencing right now? And that's a big one, because stress is stress. Your body does not differentiate from physical and mental stress. So if you're stressed out at home, or like it's exam week or something like that stress is all cumulative. And if we add on top of that in the weight room, we're adding additional stress, even though it may be different types of stress. But yeah, and then after the lift, we're asking like, how hard did you perceive that lift to be? Because if we're prescribing intensities, and it's a 6 RPE day, right, which is low, it's not very hard, and the athlete comes back and says, Coach, that was a 5 out of 5, with 5 being the hardest lift. Hard. Like, something's up with that. Like, that's not matching up to the way the lift was prescribed. So, and that could be a number of different things. Maybe their recovery is not good. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they didn't sleep very well. Or maybe they just ignored the 6 RPE part and worked at a 10 RPE all day long, and that's why they felt like it was harder. So these are all like warning signs and indicators that we got to check in with the athlete. So it's something I wish that we had the capability to do on a larger scale. We've got 70 high school athletes that we're working with almost daily. So that's kind of a challenge. But with our smaller, higher level group, our college development program, which is only 10 athletes, that's definitely something we're tracking every day with them.
Oh, cool. And then the reason why you do that is to go back and look, and again, it's just more of the conversation of then you're programming certain weight, certain intensity, and just having communication with them.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to drive adaptation and drive and achieve the optimal level of performance. You will not be performing optimally if you're fatigued and under recovered.
Beautiful. Great way to put it. Travis has been great. If someone wants to talk more with you, man, what's the best way to contact you?
Probably through social media would be the best way. # Performance on both Twitter and Instagram.
#Sports Performance.
Yep, #Sports Performance. My last name. Yep. Yeah, and they can hit me up on there. Reach out. If they head to absolutesportsperformancemd.com, my email is listed on there as well, so they can shoot me an email.
Coach Travis Hash, just giving us some great information about how to help our guys navigate the ever so more important strength program, coming from arm care to have an assessment that works for you. Don't copy and paste. Find something, because like he said, I'm guilty of it. So many coaches guilty of it. Just really when it gets down to it, it's okay. Talk to somebody, find what is important for you. I love how he mentioned like what I do at ASP and like the facility and where I own. We have the technology, different resources, and then an assessment is different when I go off campus, when I go to Loyola, when I go to the high school. They don't have those things. So even a guy that knows, yes, you just can't. What is the best thing that you have at your facility? What is the best thing that you have at your school for your team that you can assess, that you can manage, that you can say, hey, I can go off this, and we can say, hey, why aren't we getting better at this? And then we can really say, are the exercises that I'm programming and the things that I'm helping, or is it helping my guys? Loved it. Stuff with RPE and rate performance exertion, that's something that people could, I think, take away, because I know some people are percentage people. Another form of way people can do that. I love that, because one of the main things that there has been a correlation between all great coaches that I've heard here, I've had a chance to talk to, is that everyone tries to help them become the best coach. And he kind of hinted to that with RPE. That's what it kind of does. It kind of allows them to say, here's where I'm going to be. Here's what I need to be. So which is really essentially helping them become their best coach. They need to be in charge of their career. And when they take ownership, things can roll. And that's what we're all trying to do. So I like that from that point. I thought that was a pretty nice correlation from that. I loved his phases and how he clarified that. He has basically trying to get up to a power and speed block. Before that, he's getting a strength block. Before that, he's doing accumulation block. And before that, the foundation of movements. That has to be number one, and everybody goes through it from freshmen to seniors, from first getting under the bar to years under the bar. Everybody needs to do it. It just depends on the person, the frequency, and the amount that needs to be done. But everybody needs to do that. The fundamentals there. It's just like everybody needs to know how to play catch. Same kind of thing. There's definitely a correlation there. So loved how he defined that and put that out, his tier system. I think that's something that people can definitely take into. I think people can see that. Just loved his clarity, loved his detail, loved him being able to help us kind of work through this. And, even off air, we talked about, what people don't realize as like in season. Typically people in season say it's all low weight, high volume, when all of these guys that I'm talking to, and the reason I'm talking to them is when you're in season, it needs to be low weight. It needs to be high. It can be high weight with less reps. It's more like 3x3s or 4x4s, not 3x10s, 3x15s. That is not in the in season. That's the accumulation block. That's the buildup. That's higher reps. That is where you're going to feel the soreness. So we want to stick within the high weight, low reps during the season. And what we're talking a lot about, and even he talks about like where we can kind of microdose, and that kind of came up through that area and through that time off air, and that might be the best way for kids. Did they get the 20, 30-minute thing in season? Can you get in right after practice? I know like my buddy Matt Ittner, has a weightlifting, he's got a little area where they can do a little bit of lifting right outside the field. So when you get done, get a little microdose in, get home. It's a really important thing to do. So, really appreciate Coach Hash. And again, reach out to him on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Hash Sports Performance. Check out the website, www.absolutesportsperformancemd.com. Check the website out, as well as you can find his email and reach out to him that way. So, Coach Hash can't thank you enough. Will Miner, those guys at Inning Pros, thanks again. And most importantly, thank you all for keeping up, sticking with us. Hope this is becoming valuable. Like I said, this is where just a lot of people are. They're kind of in this space right now and helping their guys get better, get stronger. How do we do those kind of things? What's the best way to do it? So hopefully the resources are helping, continue to help grow the game. And until next week, keep getting better.